Shana Tova. I want to say that the work that we're doing now is not necessarily just for women, for people who are exploring a more expanded version of themselves. So. In my 20s, I was down on my knees. I'm not used to it, Mike. Here we go. In my 20s, I was down on my knees with nothing left to do but pray. Being a product of modern society, I was disoriented and confused. Ooh! Water. I was repressed and depressed. And then my prayers for finding people who could instruct me on how to be a healthy human being in these modern times were answered, above and beyond what I ever could have imagined. In my late 20s, I met John Young, founder of the Eight Shields Institute and the Wilderness Awareness School, who has informed much of the architecture that Wilderness Torah uses for their earth connection practices. There are 3 things you must do, he would say. First and foremost, go to your sit spot every day. This is a special spot in nature that I only knew about and would go to alone. In Hebrew, we call it hitbodedut, making yourself alone. The second, naturalist and survival skills. Get to know the species of plants and animals all around you. I took John very literally and very seriously. I established a sit spot practice wherever I went, studied the plants and animals through observation, nature journaling, tracking, harvesting and tending the wild, learning survival and ancestral skills. And as I went to my sit spot nearly every day, practicing hitbodedut, I could feel my body and mind starting to quiet, slowing down, listening, watching, breathing, slowing down, quieting my mind, feeling, watching, listening. Through slowing down, I began to feel. About 2.5 years into my sit spot, my hitbodedut practice, I noticed a profound shift. I felt a realigning to something more ancient, more stable, and somehow more real. I was divorcing myself from dependency on our modern society. I was remarrying myself with something much older, to the dependence on the earth. I remember the moment my nervous system shift happened. My whole body dropped into a slower, sweeter, deeper, and much more relaxed mode. In that moment, I knew I would be okay if everything else around me fell apart, that I could still feed my family and keep us warm and dry, and that everything I needed was right here in my ecosystem. As I slowed down and connected, I felt myself matching the tempo and pace of the plants, the animals, the beings of the land, and I was feeling everything, becoming sensitized to myself and the landscape around me. I felt so peaceful and connected. I was tuning into their frequency. And when I spoke and asked questions, I started to hear them answering back. A deep co-tending conversation began to emerge. This is also what is possible if we adopt a Shemitah practice, what Rabbi Zelig was talking about last night, coming into contact and a rhythm with nature. I remember one time leaning back against the scratchy bark of an old black oak tree up in Mendocino. I felt its cool, deep wisdom as I leaned back into it. I could feel my roots descending down with its roots, and my trunk getting wide and open with its trunk, and my branches flying and floating in the air, harmonizing with its branches. And then I heard the black oak say to me, or more like feel into me, get the people eating acorn. When they eat acorn, the wisdom of the land will be in them. Then we will be able to talk to them again. Tears of gratitude came to my heart and eyes as I felt the power and truth of this. I made a commitment right then and there to get people eating acorn. And if you're interested in that, come find me, let's talk. When I stepped away from these experiences, though I often felt filled with joy and awe, I was also really questioning my sanity. Am I hearing things? Am I going crazy? What's going on here? So I came to John Young with these concerns. He sat back and he laughed. He smiled. He said, "It's okay." He patted my arm. He was like, "You're just becoming human. What you're experiencing is what all humans used to feel. Humans were all sensitized to the plants and the animals and the spirits of the places that we would go. We're just so desensitized in this modern society that it's considered strange to feel and hear life speaking to you. So you're just becoming human again. Welcome." Okay. We are facing extraordinary amounts of dryness and heat right now. This has me really concerned. Is anyone else feeling concerned? Fire is consumptive. Our society is also suffering from an illness of consumption. It has a hungry ghost quality to it, consuming without being sated, without consideration of impact or long-term effect. To me, this is no surprise, because our culture has exiled our elders and put an inordinate focus on the attributes of youth, being strong and slender and sexy, moving fast, being highly self-absorbed. You might say that our society is expressing itself in an adolescent form. Here in Sonoma County, our forests have been logged twice, clear cut, using slash and burn practices. The timber companies came in, they cut down the biggest, oldest trees and pulled them out of the forest, and then burned everything, the slash, so they could push their equipment in deeper into the forest. 100 plus years later, we are left with a mess that this caused. With all the extra light that this brought into the forest, there was rapid second and third succession growth with trees. The ones in particular that grow fastest around here, the Douglas fir, which in the subsequent years, half of them have died as they shaded out each other, creating overcrowded forests with no elder trees and huge amounts of fuel load. Thus, we have catastrophic fires. And who is left to deal with the mess? Those companies are long gone. Does this remind you of a group of hungry teenagers coming into the kitchen, pulling out the best food, creating a big mess on the counter, and then leaving for someone else to clean it up? Raise your hand if this behavior sounds familiar. My elders would say that these expressions of our society are all symptoms of being disconnected, of carrying grief. Grief, one definition, is trapped emotional pain. I was taught a life cycle wheel of maturation by John Young, which came through conversations with his elders. They spoke of a wall of grief, which I call a river of grief, that separates us from separates the adolescent from becoming a full adult. An adult, someone who is responsible for their actions and is giving back to society. In order to go through the tenderizing and opening process that produces adults, one has to ford across the river of grief, both feeling and then transmuting the wounds that one carries into the gifts that they are bringing forward into life. I'm asking you, do you think that there is a relationship to these adolescent acts of taking and consuming and the environmental challenges that we're facing today? Yes. Is there a relationship between the consumptive fires internally and the imbalance of consumptive fires externally? And why? What is underneath this capitalistic greed and glut? What is motivating this behavior? And what is keeping us from maturing? John warned me of this. When you slow down you really slow down and stop enough to feel, one of the first things that you're going to intercept is grief. He would teach. There's a layer right under the surface of these lands of the historic trauma that has happened here. And you live on lands of genocide. If that trauma hasn't been condoled, this is what you're going to intercept. You need to have technologies to tend to the inner and outer grief in order to then get to the magic and beauty underneath. Living here on these lands of the Southern Pomo, the Miwok, the Onatstatis, along with most anywhere we choose to walk, sit, or call home, has the historic trauma of genocide right in the soils within a handful of generations. We as a Jewish people also walk with an incredible amount of historic trauma, which we carry as unprocessed grief, unless we've processed it. Only dig 2 generations back and the ravages of genocide are very real. We are a diasporic people. I want to invite a breath that you can take together. Is it starting to make sense why a youth glorifying people wouldn't want to slow down? Who wants to feel pain? And what the heck do you do with it when you do start to feel it? What does an adolescent do with pain? Avoid it or react to it. Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't feel. Distract. Consume. Do drugs. Try and fill the void. I want to posit that our society is in an adolescent state. And the fires we are facing are fires of initiation. We as a people will either get lost down the river of grief if we don't metabolize it, or we'll ford across the river and make it to the banks of responsible adulthood as a society. So an important question becomes, what are our technologies or societal pathways for processing grief, pain, rage, anger, loss, sadness? We are going to tap into some of those technologies tomorrow with Jen Mizell and Sarai Shapiro. Thank you. Feels like a lot? It is. It is a lot. And we're not alone. And we're designed to do this. Remember how I said John Young introduced me to 3 pathways? 1 was sit spot, 2 naturalist studies and survival skills. The 3rd was grief release practices. When I met John, I was at a time in my life when I was deeply betrayed and disappointed by the adult world around me, the adult world. He instructed me to start a fire in a sacred manner, and then sit and tend that fire in that intentional way from dusk all the way till dawn. I was shown how in creating a sacred fire, it would become a doorway, a portal to the more than human world. And the more that I fed it and honored it, the stronger it became as a healing fire. I was shown how to make certain materials into offerings and to feed that fire, and in essence, to feed the spirit world. Our Hebrew ancestors had this technology as well. We had a sacred fire that was a portal to God for centuries in the temple. And the Baal Shem Tov, he was said to have utilized sacred fire for healing in his own forests. Reb Zelig teaches about it all the time. And we have been bringing these traditions back into our communities. Sitting at sacred fire after sacred fire, having a place to emote, release my anger and sadness, my hurt and confusion, my hardened heart would slowly start to soften and open back to the awe and magic of the world. It was as if more and more space was freed up inside me, and I felt more and more natural upwellings of gratitude, creativity, joy. When I went through this recipe that I'm describing, anyone would experience some version of this if they sat through the same process. So wherever you sit on your own resensitizing and reconnecting journey, I want to invite you to take it seriously and continue down the path There is a movement afoot, and you are a part of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. It's called Earth-Based Judaism, bringing Jewish people from a book people back into an earth-connected people. It seems to me that having a strong relationship with the earth is key to being an earth-based people. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. And by earth, I mean the earth that you're standing on, that we are standing on, living on, walking on. Where do you call home? This is not a metaphoric or esoteric connection that I'm talking about. It is evident to me that Judaism will continue to eddy, to swirl around and around in the same broken trauma record dance until we slow down, listen, feel, make contact, make direct contact and direct relationship with the land that we're living on. The pertinent question, it seems for me, for our earth-based Jewish movement, to take us out of this eddy is, how do we come out of being a diasporic people and come into being a rooted people? What is needed to leave the path of exile and to commit to a land base and begin to call it home? Practicing Shemitah, which Reb Zelig talked about last night, it's a part of this response. Here's a little bit of my story about putting roots down. I grew up just east of here, West Sonoma County. Not only is it beautiful there, but I have family in the area. And though I wanted desperately to settle there, I couldn't. I kept experiencing being agitated and restless. I needed to keep moving. In my 20s, I just followed that impulse. When I hit my 30s, I dug deeper into why I couldn't just settle down. I discovered that I could feel all of the pain in my family line, and it felt overwhelming. Sitting deep in the night with a sacred fire, I prayed about what to do. Spirit came to me in the wee hours of the morning. Are you serious? Are you sure you want this? Yes. Make 8 sacred fires, I was instructed. 4 for your great-grandparents on your father's side, and 4 for your great-grandparents on your mother's side. 1 fire dedicated to each great-grandparent. Make an altar to that great-grandparent, learn about them, feed them through the fire with offerings, and sit with them all night, from dusk till dawn. Wow. Okay. It took me about 1.5 years to complete all these fires. I was nomadic during that time, living out of my van, really wanting to have a place to call home. And days after I completed the last fire, I got a phone call. It was from an old beloved housemate of mine. Hey, we're setting up a communal house in Sebastopol. Do you want to come be a part of it? Yes! Yes. And when I arrived at that home, I laid down in the backyard and I felt my roots descending from my body and planting into the soils. Over 10 years later, I'm gratefully still here. I believe that one of the greatest acts of our time, right now, is to learn the land until you fall in love with it. And then to take the time to condole the historic trauma of our recent past. That we work to condole, condolar. That means with pain, to sit with or be with the pain. Our blood lineage and what I call our bone lineage, the lineage of the land that we walk, eat, sleep, make love on, birth upon. This means making contact with the First Nations people of the land you live on. Learn the history of the land and become an ally to justice. When we sit and allow the feelings to be felt, this brings moisture and coolness back to our inner and outer landscapes. And here is the intersection of quenching the internal and the external fires through quelling the fires of destruction by turning them into fires of transformation and initiation. When we do this, we'll be able to put our roots back down as a people. We will be in present time relationship with the people and beings on the land, as well as spirit and our ancestors, who can once again inform us. A new conversation and pathway starts to emerge, one that weaves a new tapestry with the local ecology, where our traditions and our love has become a home again and can come alive through us living them rather than reading about them. So if we choose to do this, any of what I've spoken about, Hippolyte and Shemitah, this is where the magic happens. Suddenly we are on the front lines of a story in a landscape never traversed. This is where watering our souls comes into watering the landscape. This is Tikkun Olam. This is leaving exile and putting our roots down. This is where slowing down to feel can lead to feeding our world, which leads to flourishing. This, I believe, is what is beckoning us from the world to come.